My daughter-in-law changed the locks, brought her parents and announced, "This house now belongs to us." I was treated like an intruder in the place where I built my entire life, and I listened in silence as they erased my history. I slept in fear, ate in silence, and pretended not to see when my memories were thrown in the trash. But deep down I knew, what they tried to steal with arrogance, I would reclaim with courage. If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us which city you're watching from. We continue. I promise this will be the best story you'll ever hear in your life. The Portland sky was dawning lazily when Helen Morgan closed her last suitcase. At 62, she had lived one of the most transformative experiences of her life in recent weeks. The small apartment in Boston, where her eldest son, Richard, had built a new life, had become a refuge of unexpected joys. The cry of her newborn grandson, walks along the cobblestone streets, lengthy conversations on balconies while the sun set. All of it had brought color back to an existence that had long been reduced to shades of gray. Helen ran her fingers over the blue hardcover notebook she had bought at a stationery store near her son's apartment. On its pages, words written in handwriting that mixed elegance and haste. Today Matthew smiled at me for the first time. Can a 2-month-old baby already recognize his grandmother? Richard says yes. I prefer to believe him, even knowing it might just be kindness. The trip, planned to last 3 months, would be shortened to just 5 weeks. The phone call from Greg, her younger son, still echoed in her mind. His normally controlled voice trembled as he explained that he had lost his rental contract, that his wife Caitlin was pregnant with their 3rd child, that he didn't know where to go with his 2 young children. "Mom, we need help, just for a few weeks until we find another place." How could she deny shelter to her own son? Impossible. Even if it meant postponing her dream of getting to know her Boston grandson better, of following his first months, of rebuilding her relationship with Richard, who had lived so far away for years. "Mom, we're ready to board." The flight attendant's voice interrupted her thoughts. Helen tucked the notebook into her bag and followed the boarding corridor, dragging with her not just 2 suitcases, but a heart divided between the anticipated longing for what she was leaving behind and the certainty of doing the right thing by returning. 12 hours later, exhausted from the transatlantic flight, Helen finally arrived at her house in South Portland. The taxi stopped in front of the yellow 2-story house that she had bought with her divorce settlement 15 years ago. The modest construction, with a small garden in front, represented her late independence, achieved after decades of a marriage that had dissolved like sand between fingers. Something seemed different. The curtains she had left, white with small embroidered flowers, had been replaced by darker ones. In the garden, the fern pots she had cultivated with such care were no longer there. In their place, a set of colorful plastic chairs. Helen frowned as she searched for her keys in her purse. Before she could find them, the door opened. Caitlin, her daughter-in-law, appeared with a tense smile on her lips. "Helen, good to see you've arrived. We were waiting for you." She hugged her quickly, taking one of the suitcases. "Come in. Everyone's eager to see you." Everyone? Helen entered her own house like someone entering unknown territory. The entrance hall, previously decorated with an antique sideboard and an oval mirror, now housed a modern entertainment center with an enormous television. The walls, which were a soft shade of green, had been painted white. "We made some changes to accommodate everyone," explained Caitlin, noticing Helen's perplexed look. "Greg thought you wouldn't mind." Before she could respond, Helen was wrapped in a strong embrace. Greg, her younger son, held her as if she was something precious and fragile. "Mom, I've missed you so much. Forgive the invasion, but we needed a place quickly. I promise it's temporary." Helen smiled, trying to ignore the discomfort growing in her chest. After all, it was her son. Her family needed her. "Grandma!" The childish voices of Isabella, 7, and Matthew, 5, echoed through the living room as they ran in her direction. Helen bent down to hug them, feeling her heart melt with the children's affection. "Look, Grandma, I got a room all to myself," exclaimed Isabella, pulling her by the hand. "Come see." With a forced smile, Helen let herself be guided by her granddaughter down the hallway. As she passed through the dining room, she noticed that her solid wood table, an inheritance from her grandmother, had been replaced by a modern glass table. "Where's my table?" she asked, stopping suddenly. Greg appeared behind her, scratching the back of his neck, a gesture he had made since childhood when nervous. "Oh, that old table? We stored it in the basement. We needed more space, and this glass one is more practical with the children." Helen nodded in silence, swallowing her indignation. It was just a table after all. She continued following Isabella down the bedroom hallway. "This is my room now." The girl opened a door with enthusiasm. Helen recognized, stunned, her own bedroom. The king-size bed she had bought as a present to herself on her 60th birthday had been replaced by a pink canopy bed for a child. The walls, once a soft blue, now displayed princess and unicorn stickers. "It's beautiful, dear," she managed to say, feeling her throat tighten. "And where are my things?" "In the guest room," replied Caitlin, appearing behind them. "We thought it would be better for you. It's quieter, away from the children's commotion." The guest room. The smallest room in the house, at the end of the hallway, with just one window that faced the neighbor's wall. Helen took a deep breath, trying to contain the feeling of displacement that was invading her. "Grandma, come see who else is here." Matthew pulled her hand, leading her back to the living room. That's when Helen saw them, comfortably seated on the sofa. Her beige suede sofa, now covered with a patterned slipcover, were a middle-aged man and woman she had never seen before. "Helen, these are my parents, Carl and Marcia," introduced Caitlin with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "They came to help us with the move, and will be staying with us for a while." Carl stood up, extending his hand with a confidence that bordered on presumption. "Finally, we meet the famous Helen. Caitlin talks about you a lot. I hope you don't mind our presence. I promise we'll be discreet." Helen shook his hand mechanically, feeling like a stranger in her own home. The living room, which had always been her personal refuge, now seemed occupied by cordial invaders. "We made a special dinner to celebrate your return," said Marcia, also standing. "I hope you like feijoada. I took the liberty of using your kitchen." Helen forced a smile, unable to articulate any response that wouldn't sound rude or ungrateful. She allowed herself to be led to the dining room, where the glass table was set for 7 people. During dinner, she tried to participate in the conversation, but every word exchange seemed to confirm her growing suspicion. This was no longer her house. It was as if she had been transported to a parallel universe, where her existence was merely tolerated, not celebrated. "Helen, you don't need to worry about anything in the coming days," said Carl, helping himself to more wine, the wine she kept for special occasions. "We reorganized everything so you can rest. At your age, you deserve to enjoy life without stress." At your age. The words fell like stones upon her shoulders. Later, alone in the small guest room, Helen opened the blue notebook and wrote with trembling hands, "I returned home today, but the house didn't recognize me, nor did I recognize it. Something tells me this temporary help might be more permanent than I imagined. How do you say no when it's your own children? How do you demand respect without seeming selfish? Tomorrow, when the travel fatigue passes, I'll talk with Greg. We'll establish boundaries. After all, this house is still mine." She didn't know, as she closed the notebook and tried to fall asleep on the narrow bed, that this would be just the first night of a silent battle for the right to exist in her own space. A week passed, and Helen still hadn't managed to have the planned conversation with Greg. Whenever she tried to address the subject of changes or establish some boundary, something happened. One of the children needed attention. Caitlin wasn't feeling well because of the pregnancy, or Greg was busy with job interviews. The serious conversation was continually postponed, slipping through her fingers like fine sand. That Sunday morning, Helen woke up earlier than the rest of the household, determined to reclaim at least one small ritual, preparing her breakfast in peace, sitting on the back porch, watching the birds that used to visit the small feeder she had installed years ago. She descended the stairs silently, avoiding the steps that creaked as she used to do when her children were small, and she wanted a few moments of solitude. In the kitchen, however, she found Marcia already awake, wearing her favorite apron, the one with lavender embroidery that Richard had brought her from Provence. The woman was handling her pots with the intimacy of someone who had always lived there. "Good morning, Helen. I'm up early today." Marcia smiled, stirring something on the stove. "I'm preparing a special breakfast for everyone, American pancakes, the way Carl likes them. Do you mind if we use that maple syrup I found in your pantry?" Before Helen could even respond, the woman continued, "Oh, and I noticed you have old china stored in that corner cabinet. We should use them for Caitlin's birthday next week. We're planning a small party right here." "Party?" Helen frowned, leaning on the doorframe. "No one mentioned any party to me." Marcia waved her hand in the air as if shooing away an insignificant insect. Oh, it must be because Greg wanted to make it a surprise. But since you've discovered it, you can help us. We're thinking about 30 guests. Nothing too big. 30 people in her house without her consent. Helen felt the blood rise to her face but breathed deeply. Conflicts would resolve nothing, especially with the children nearby. Marcia, we need to talk about boundaries and consideration. This is still my house, and decisions like parties need to be discussed with me first. The other woman's expression hardened for an instant, but was soon replaced by a condescending smile. Of course, Helen, you're absolutely right. It's just that, well, we're all so worried about you. After that long trip, we thought you needed rest, not to be involved with domestic details. At your age, it's important to conserve energy, isn't it? There it was again. At your age. As if her 62 years made her invalid, incapable of giving an opinion about the events in her own house. Before she could formulate an adequate response, Matthew came running into the kitchen, followed by Greg. The boy hugged her legs tightly. Grandma, are we going to the park today? Please, please. Helen smiled at her grandson, stroking his hair. Of course, my love. We can go after breakfast. Actually, Mom, interrupted Greg, I already promised to take the kids to the club with Caitlin's parents. They're members of that new club in the Highland Park neighborhood. You can come too if you want. The club doesn't allow visitors over 60 on Sundays, commented Marcia, without taking her eyes off the pancakes. Their policy to keep the environment young and dynamic on weekends. Helen seriously doubted the existence of such a rule, but decided not to question it. Instead, she forced a smile. That's fine. I'll take the opportunity to put some things in order. The morning passed in a whirlwind of activities. The entire family seemed busy with preparations for the trip to the club, leaving Helen increasingly isolated. She decided to take advantage of their future absence to reorganize her belongings in the small guest room. When everyone finally left, Helen breathed with relief. The silence of the empty house was like a balm for her frayed nerves. She walked slowly through the rooms, collecting small personal objects that had been displaced. A photograph of her with Richard when he graduated from college, a crystal vase she had received from her mother, a small desk clock that had marked so many important hours of her life. In the bedroom that was once hers, now occupied by Isabella, Helen looked in the built-in wardrobe for some clothes she hadn't been able to take to the guest room. When she opened the last drawer, she found something that made her freeze, a folder with documents. Curious, she opened it and found papers from her own house. Deed, property tax, paid bills, meticulously organized, along with notes she didn't recognize. On a yellow paper, a handwritten list by Carl: check validity of will, consult lawyer about adverse possession, sound out neighbors about length of residence. Helen felt her blood freeze in her veins. This didn't seem like a temporary occupation. It seemed like a carefully architected plan. Quickly, she photographed the documents with her cell phone and put everything back in place, exactly as she had found it. Still trembling from the discovery, she decided to look for more evidence. In the office she had once used for reading and paying bills, now transformed into a bedroom for Caitlin's parents, she found her computer turned on. On the screen, an open email from Carl to a lawyer, questioning prolonged residence rights and property transfer after minimum time of continuous habitation. Helen left the office with her heart racing, feeling like an intruder in her own home. In the hallway she found Isabella, who had apparently forgotten something and returned early. "Grandma, what are you doing in Grandpa Carl and Grandma Marcia's room?" The girl observed her with innocent curiosity. Helen forced a smile. "I was just looking for a book I think I left here, dear. Did you come back alone?" "Grandpa Carl brought me. He said he's going to stay in the house for at least 2 years, until he resolves everything with paper." "What does that mean, Grandma?" 2 years. Resolve everything with paper. Her granddaughter's words confirmed her darkest suspicions. Helen sat on the stair-step, inviting Isabella to sit beside her. "Isabella, dear, do you remember when we talked about good secrets and bad secrets?" The girl nodded, serious. "Good secrets are birthday surprises. Bad secrets are ones that can hurt someone." "Exactly. I need you to tell me more about this subject, but this will be our good secret, okay? Because Grandma needs to understand some things." Isabella played with the hem of her dress, thoughtful. "Grandpa Carl and Grandma Marcia talk a lot about this house when they think no one is listening. They said it's too big for just one elderly person, that you should live in a smaller place." Helen felt a lump in her throat, but maintained her composure. "And what else did they say, dear?" "That Dad and Mom need help, but they're too proud to ask for money. And that you have a lot of money saved." Isabella looked at her grandmother with innocence. "Is it true that you're rich, Grandma?" Helen smiled sadly. She wasn't rich, far from it. She had only the house, fruit of the division of assets from the divorce, and a small savings that guaranteed a modest life without luxuries. "I'm not rich, my love. I just have enough to live peacefully." She hugged her granddaughter tightly. "Thank you for talking with me. Now how about we get some ice cream before the others get back? It will be our little secret." At the neighborhood ice cream shop, while Isabella was distracted with a huge bowl of chocolate with strawberries, Helen sent a message to Richard in Boston. "Son, we need to talk urgently. Complicated situation here. Can we do a video call tonight?" For the rest of the day, Helen maintained appearances. She smiled during dinner, listened patiently to the enthusiastic reports about the club, agreed with plans for the next day. But inside, a plan was beginning to form. Late at night, when everyone was asleep, she locked herself in the bathroom, turned on the shower to muffle the sound, and made the video call with Richard. In urgent whispers, she reported everything she had discovered. "Mom, that's absurd." Richard's indignation was visible even through the small screen of the cell phone. "You need to confront them immediately." "It's not that simple, son. Greg is fragile, unemployed, with a pregnant wife and 2 children. I can't just kick them out. But you also can't allow them to take your house. And what about Caitlin's parents? What do we know about them?" Helen hesitated. "Almost nothing. Greg rarely talked about them before, only that they lived in a small town and weren't very present." "I'll investigate," decided Richard. "I have a journalist friend who can do some discreet research. In the meantime, Mom, promise you'll be careful. Don't confront anyone until we have more information." Helen agreed, ending the call with her heart a little lighter. She wasn't alone in this battle. Back in the guest room, she opened the blue notebook and wrote, "The invasion is not just physical, it's calculated and methodical. Today I discovered that they're not just occupying spaces. They're trying to erase my existence, my history, my right to belong, like a parasitic plant that grows slowly, sucking the life from the host without her noticing until it's too late. But it's not too late yet. I still have a voice, I still have rights, and above all, I still have truth on my side. Starting tomorrow, I begin my silent resistance." She closed the notebook and hid it inside a pillowcase at the bottom of the wardrobe. Then, she took from her pocket a small recorder that she had secretly bought during the outing with Isabella. She placed it under the bed, pressing the record button. If Carl and Marcia were documenting her life to use against her, it was time to retaliate with the same weapons. Helen slept that night with the determination of someone who knows that a long battle is just beginning. What disturbed her most was not the prospect of the fight itself, but the possibility of losing her son in the process. How could she make Greg see the manipulation without seeming like she was trying to distance him from his new family? How could she reclaim her house without destroying the bonds that still remained? The following days transformed into a careful choreography for Helen. During the day, she maintained the polite smile, accepted the small daily humiliations, and made mental notes of each suspicious movement. At night, she recorded everything in her blue notebook and strategically positioned the small recorders she had bought at an electronics store downtown. Caitlin's birthday party, which was supposed to be a small event, transformed into a celebration for almost 50 people. Helen's house, once a haven of tranquility, now vibrated with unknown voices. In the center of the living room, a huge banner, "Welcome to the Miller family home," the surname of Caitlin's parents, not hers. During the party, Helen circulated silently among the guests, a glass of sparkling water in hand. Everyone assumed it was gin, and she didn't bother to correct them. She heard fragments of conversations that confirmed her suspicions. "Carl and Marcia finally managed to establish themselves in Portland," commented a middle-aged woman to another. "After all that trouble with the house in Greenfield, I thought they'd never manage again." "Trouble in Greenfield?" asked Helen, approaching casually. The women exchanged embarrassed looks, as if they had been caught saying too much. "Oh, nothing important. Just a misunderstanding with the former owner," one of them replied, quickly moving away. Helen noted the name Greenfield in her cell phone. Another clue for Richard to investigate. The day after the party, while everyone was still asleep, Helen listened to the recordings from the previous night. Among laughter and music, she caught a conversation in the office between Carl and a man who introduced himself as his lawyer. "The situation is ideal," Carl was saying. "The old lady practically has no support here. The older son lives out of the country, and the younger one is in our hands. Just 18 months of proven residence and we can file for family adverse possession." "It's not that simple," replied the lawyer. "The owner needs to appear absent, negligent, or incapable, and she lives here." "For now," Carl responded with a laugh. "We're taking care of that. When the house becomes routine, nobody takes it away anymore." Helen felt a chill run down her spine. The phrase sounded like a sinister mantra. Immediately, she sent the recording to Richard with the message, "They're planning to use some kind of adverse possession. I need urgent legal help." Richard's response came hours later, along with disturbing information. "We found records of 3 lawsuits against Carl and Marcia Miller in different cities. In all of them, the same pattern. They moved into homes of vulnerable people, lonely elderly or families in financial difficulty, offering temporary help. Then they took the property through legal maneuvers or psychological pressure. In Greenfield, they even managed to get judicial interdiction of a 78-year-old woman, claiming she was mentally incapable. I've hired a lawyer specialized in real estate law there in Portland. He'll contact you tomorrow." Helen put away her cell phone with trembling hands. Her intuition was correct. It wasn't just about invasion of space. It was a calculated scam with a history of success. But why didn't Greg notice? Or was it possible that he knew everything and was complicit? The answer came that same afternoon, when Helen heard a heated discussion between Greg and Caitlin in the couple's bedroom. "I can't continue with this farce," Greg was saying, his voice choked. "It's my mother's house, Caitlin. We promised to stay just a few weeks." "And where would we go?" replied Caitlin, crying. "You still haven't found a job. I'm pregnant, and my parents invested everything they had here." "Invested? They practically moved in without warning, and now your father keeps making insinuations about property transfer, about how your mother takes better care of the house than mine. This isn't right." "My parents are just trying to help, Greg. Helen has this huge house just for herself, while we barely had a place to live. It's fair that she shares what she has with the family." "Sharing is different from taking, Caitlin, and your parents are taking. Don't you see how they treat my mother? Like an unwelcome guest, an intruder in her own house." The discussion continued, revealing to Helen that her son was not complicit. He was another victim, manipulated by feelings of failure and pressure from his in-laws. She felt a mixture of relief and sadness. How could she resolve that situation without destroying the family that Greg was trying to keep together? The next morning, the doorbell rang. Helen answered, finding a woman with a serious expression, dressed formally. "Good morning. I'm Danielle Ferreira, social worker from the County Council on Aging. We received an anonymous complaint about a possible situation of vulnerability of an elderly person at this address." Helen's heart accelerated. It was another tactic of the Millers, trying to intimidate her with a false accusation of neglect or abuse. Fortunately, she was alone at home. The others had gone out for a family lunch to which she had not been invited. "I'm Helen Morgan, the owner of this house," she responded firmly, inviting the social worker to enter. "And I believe I am the elderly person supposedly in a situation of vulnerability." For almost 2 hours, Helen reported to Danielle everything that had been happening. She showed the recordings, the documents found, the messages from Richard, with the investigations about the Millers' past. The social worker listened attentively, taking notes. "Mrs. Morgan, what you're describing is a classic case of patrimonial violence against an elderly person, aggravated by psychological abuse. I can help you file a formal complaint." "Not yet," replied Helen after a few moments of reflection. "My son and my grandchildren are involved. I need to resolve this in a way that doesn't destroy them. I understand your concern, but your safety and well-being must be a priority." Danielle handed her a card. "Call me if the situation worsens, or if you change your mind. In the meantime, I suggest you document everything and seek legal support." After the social worker's departure, Helen reflected on her situation. She had sufficient evidence to expel the invaders, but at what cost? Greg was already fragile due to unemployment, and now faced a family conflict. The children adored their maternal grandparents, despite everything. And Caitlin, even being manipulated by her parents, was pregnant and vulnerable. That night, Helen received a call from the lawyer indicated by Richard. After a long conversation, he confirmed her suspicions. The Millers were trying to create conditions for a family adverse possession claim, a modality that allows the transfer of property between members of the same family after a certain period of possession. The good news is that they don't stand a chance, explained the lawyer. You are the legitimate owner. You live in the house and have not abandoned the property. The bad news is that the longer they remain, the more arguments they can build to try other types of legal maneuvers. What do you suggest? An immediate extrajudicial notification followed by a repossession action if necessary. Helen thanked him for the advice, but asked for a few days to think. Before taking drastic measures, she wanted to try one last approach. The following morning, she found Greg alone in the kitchen, preparing coffee. It was the opportunity she had been waiting for. "Son, can we talk? In private?" Greg nodded, seeming relieved to finally have a moment alone with his mother. They went to the small backyard, the only space that had not yet been completely transformed by the Millers. "Greg, I know you're going through a difficult time," began Helen, carefully choosing her words, "and I want you to know that you'll always have my support. Always." Her son lowered his eyes, visibly emotional. "I know that, Mom, and I feel horrible about what's happening. It wasn't supposed to be like this. I'm not here to accuse you, son. I'm worried about you, about Caitlin, about my grandchildren, and about myself, too." She took a deep breath. "Caitlin's parents aren't just helping us. They have a plan to take this house." Greg raised his eyes, surprised not by the revelation itself, but by hearing his mother verbalize it. How do you know?" Helen showed some of the evidence she had collected in recent weeks, the recordings, the documents, the investigations about the Millers' past. With each new revelation, she saw her son's face pale. "Mom, I swear I didn't know the extent of this. I suspected some things, but I thought it was just my insecurity, my fear of failing as a father and husband." "You're not failing, Greg. You're trying to protect your family, but they're using that love against you, against us." Greg ran his hands over his face in a gesture of profound fatigue. "What will we do now? I can't simply expel Caitlin's parents. She's pregnant. She would be devastated. We don't need to act precipitously, but we need to act." Helen held her son's hands. "Richard is coming back next week. Together, we'll find a solution that respects everyone." What Helen didn't tell Greg at that moment was that Richard wasn't coming alone. He was bringing with him even more concrete evidence about the Millers' criminal past, including testimonies from other victims. The complete truth would be too painful for her son at that moment. In the days that followed, Helen noticed a subtle change in Greg's behavior. He began to question some of his in-laws' decisions, to defend small spaces for his mother, to insist that she be included in family programs. They were small but significant gestures, the beginning of a resistance. The Millers, in turn, intensified their efforts. One morning, Helen found personal correspondence opened on her desk. At night, she heard Carl on the phone, discussing the possibility of evaluating the mental capacity of the owner. On another occasion, she discovered they had transferred the electricity bill to Greg's name without authorization. The pressure increased day by day. Small accidents began to happen. A plate that slipped near Helen, almost hitting her. A stair step that mysteriously came loose when she was going down. Medications that disappeared from her bedside table. In her blue notebook, now kept in a bank safe for security, Helen wrote, "The violence is now more evident, less disguised. I feel they're getting desperate, which makes them more dangerous, but also more careless. Each of their mistakes is one more piece of evidence for our cause. Richard arrives in 2 days. Until then, I need to stay calm and protect Greg. He's beginning to see the truth, but he's still trapped in a web of manipulation and fear." The night before Richard's arrival, Helen was surprised by an unusual invitation, a family dinner organized by Carl and Marcia. "To thank you for your hospitality," they explained, with smiles that didn't reach their eyes. The dinner proceeded in a tense atmosphere, despite attempts at a festive appearance. The children, oblivious to the adults' conflict, animated the table with their stories. Caitlin seemed nervous, avoiding Helen's gaze. It was at the moment of dessert that Carl finally revealed the true purpose of that gathering. "Helen, we have a proposal for you." He served more wine, although Helen had barely touched her first glass. "We're all so happy living together here, aren't we? A true united family." We thought about formalizing this situation. Formalizing? Helen raised an eyebrow, maintaining her composure despite her racing heart. "Yes. Greg told us that you were considering making a will, leaving the house to your grandchildren. Why wait? You could transfer part of the property to little Matthew right now as proof of love." Helen looked at Greg, who seemed as surprised as she was. "I never mentioned any will, son." "I know, Mom. I don't understand where this idea came from." Carl cleared his throat, visibly annoyed by Greg's lack of cooperation. "Well, maybe it wasn't exactly like that. But the idea's good, isn't it? Ensuring the future of your grandchildren." "My grandchildren will have their future guaranteed without me having to give up my house, Carl." Helen kept her voice calm but firm. "And they don't need intermediaries to receive my love." The rest of the dinner proceeded in a heavy silence, broken only by Marcia's awkward attempts to resume trivial conversations. Helen observed the faces around the table. Carl with poorly disguised anger, Marcia anxious and calculating, Caitlin divided and confused, Greg beginning to see the truth behind the manipulations, and the children, innocent pawns in a game of ambitious adults. Back in her small room, Helen sent a message to Richard. "They tried to convince me to transfer the house to Matthew today. They're getting desperate. I'll arrive early at the airport tomorrow. Bring everything you have." The response came almost immediately. "I'll be on the 9 a.m. flight. I have more than we expected. We'll end this once and for all, Mom. Hang tight for one more night." Helen fell asleep with a strange feeling in her chest, a mixture of fear and hope. Tomorrow would be the day of truth, the moment when she would finally confront her invaders with all the evidence gathered. It wouldn't be an easy battle, but she was ready to fight. Not just for the house itself, but for the right to fully exist, to be respected, to maintain her dignity, and above all for the future of her children and grandchildren, a future built on truth and respect, not on manipulation and lies. Portland International Airport was busy that Thursday morning. Helen arrived early, her heart racing with the expectation of reuniting with Richard, and the certainty that that day would mark the beginning of the end of that nightmare. When the plane landed and passengers began to disembark, Helen felt a lump in her throat. There was something different in Richard's posture, a determination she hadn't seen for years in her older son, always so reserved and cautious. "Mom." The long embrace said more than words. When they separated, Helen noticed that he wasn't coming alone. "This is Lisa Cardwell, a lawyer specialized in elder law and property issues," introduced Richard. "And this is Paul Martinez, an investigative journalist. He specializes in real estate fraud cases." Helen greeted them both with a mixture of relief and apprehension. The presence of those professionals confirmed the seriousness of the situation, but also indicated that she was no longer alone in the battle. During the journey to a nearby cafe, Richard updated his mother on what they had discovered. "The Millers have a history of at least 5 similar cases in 3 different states," he explained, showing documents on his tablet. "In Greenfield, as I had already mentioned, they managed to get judicial interdiction of an elderly lady. In Florence, they persuaded a widowed man to put the house in his granddaughter's name, who coincidentally was their goddaughter. In Cumberland, they forced the sale of a property from an indebted family for much less than the market value. Their method is always the same," complimented Paul, the journalist. "They identify vulnerable people, lonely elderly, families in financial crisis, and approach offering help. Then they use tactics of psychological pressure, social isolation, and, when necessary, legal maneuvers to acquire the property." Helen listened to everything with surprising calmness. Somehow, the confirmation of her suspicions brought a strange feeling of validation. She wasn't paranoid, she wasn't exaggerating. The danger was real and had a name, face, and method. "What do we do now?" she asked, looking at Lisa, the lawyer. "We have sufficient evidence for an immediate legal action," replied the professional, organizing some documents. "But first, I suggest a direct approach. A controlled confrontation, with all the evidence in hand, can resolve the situation without prolonging the emotional distress for you and your family. Confront them all together?" Helen felt a chill in her stomach imagining the scene. "Exactly. With all cards on the table, without more room for manipulation or denial." Lisa looked directly into Helen's eyes. "But for this, we need your son Greg's cooperation. Is he willing to face the truth?" Helen hesitated. The latest conversations with Greg indicated a change in his perception. But from there to openly confronting his in-laws and possibly creating an irreparable conflict with his wife, I'm not sure. He's begun to see some things, but he's still very vulnerable. Then our first stop needs to be with him, decided Richard, alone without the presence of the Millers or Caitlin. Getting this private meeting was not easy. After several messages, Greg finally agreed to meet them at a distant restaurant during his lunch hour. He arrived visibly tense, his face marked by nights of insomnia. Richard, the embrace between the brothers was awkward, loaded with contained emotions. I didn't know you'd return so soon from Boston. Some situations require presence, not words, replied Richard, indicating the others at the table. These are friends who came to help us. For the next 2 hours, Greg listened in silence to the evidence presented against his wife's parents. With each new document, with each recording played, his face revealed a complex mixture of emotions: shock, shame, anger, sadness. This can't be true, he murmured, more to himself than to the others, when Paul showed old reports about the Millers' previous scams. Caitlin wouldn't know. She wouldn't participate. We believe your wife may be as much a victim as you are, clarified Lisa, with a gentle but firm voice. Narcissistic and manipulative people like Carl and Marcia usually control their closest family members first. Greg covered his face with his hands, breathing deeply. When he finally looked at his mother, his eyes were teary. Forgive me, Mom. I should have protected you, our family, our home. Instead, I brought danger inside. Helen extended her hand across the table, holding her son's. Don't blame yourself, Greg. You were also manipulated. What's important now is that we correct this together. How? His voice was almost a whisper. We need to confront them today, explained Richard, with all the evidence, with the whole family present. No more hiding places, no more manipulation. Greg remained silent for long minutes, processing what he had just heard. Finally, he nodded. I'll call Caitlin. Ask her to be at home with the children at 7 o'clock. I'll say we have a surprise for everyone. The rest of the day was dedicated to preparation. Helen, Richard, and the professionals organized the evidence, planned the approach, anticipated possible reactions. At 6:30, they parked 2 blocks from the house, so the Millers wouldn't notice their early arrival. Are you ready? Asked Richard, squeezing his mother's hand before they left the car. Helen took a deep breath, feeling an unexpected calm take over her being. More than ever. When they entered the house, Richard carrying a folder full of documents, Paul with his recording equipment, and Lisa with her imposing and professional presence, the shock was immediate. Carl and Marcia, who were in the living room talking with Greg and Caitlin, stood up abruptly. Richard, what an unexpected surprise, said Carl, extending his hand with a forced smile. Helen didn't mention you were coming. Richard ignored the extended hand, placing the folder on the center table. I believe there are many things that haven't been mentioned in this house, Mr. Miller. Carl's smile faltered. Marcia, more perceptive, already seemed to understand the gravity of the situation. What does this mean? Who are these people? They're friends, replied Helen with a tranquility that surprised everyone, including herself. Friends who helped me understand exactly what has been happening here in recent months. Greg stood up, positioning himself beside his mother. Caitlin, it's better if the children aren't present for this conversation. Can you take them to their room? Caitlin, confused and apprehensive, hesitated. What's happening, Greg? Please, Caitlin, he insisted with gentle firmness. I promise to explain everything later. But now, the children need to be in another environment. Reluctantly, Caitlin took Isabella and Matthew upstairs. When she returned, the atmosphere in the room was pure tension. Now, began Lisa, naturally assuming control of the situation, let's clarify some important points. I'm Lisa Cardwell, a lawyer specialized in elder law and property issues. We're here to discuss the irregular situation that has been established in this residence and the evidence of attempted undue appropriation of property. This is absurd, exclaimed Carl, rising indignantly. We came only to help our daughter and our son-in-law in a difficult time. Helen invited us to stay. I did invite you, agreed Helen, keeping her voice calm, for a temporary stay, while Greg found another place. Not for you to take my house, change locks, reorganize my belongings, open my correspondence, and plan a family adverse possession scam. The specific mention of adverse possession made Carl visibly pale. Marcia intervened, trying to regain control. These are serious and unfounded accusations. We are deeply hurt that you think this way about us, Helen. Unfounded? Paul, the journalist, opened his laptop. Perhaps you'd like to explain these documents then. One by one, Paul and Lisa presented the evidence, the recordings of conversations between Carl and his lawyer, the documents found, the previous lawsuits in other cities, the testimonies of other victims. With each new revelation, Caitlin sank deeper into the sofa, her face a mask of horror and disbelief. Dad? Her voice was almost childlike in its vulnerability. This can't be true. Tell me it's not true. Carl tried one last card. It's all a conspiracy, daughter. Richard has always been jealous. He never accepted your marriage to Greg. Now he's manipulating everyone against us. Conspiracy. Richard opened a file on his tablet. This is a 2018 report from the Greenfield Journal. Couple investigated for real estate fraud against elderly woman. The photos are yours, Mr. and Mrs. Miller, or will you deny that's you? The silence that followed was deafening. Marcia was the first to break it, with a bitter laugh. Always so naive, all of you. Do you know how much a house like this in a neighborhood like this is worth? Millions. And she, pointing to Helen, wasting it all, living alone in a space that could house an entire family. The house is mine, replied Helen with dignity. Fruit of my work, my choices, my life. It's not a waste to live in peace in the space I earned. You have exactly 48 hours to leave this residence, announced Lisa, handing a document to Carl. This is an extrajudicial notification. If you don't comply with the deadline, we'll file a repossession action, as well as criminal charges for patrimonial violence against an elderly person, attempted fraud, and ideological falsehood. Carl crumpled the paper, his face contorted in fury. This isn't over. We have rights. We invested in this house. We improved this place. Actually, intervened Greg, who had been silent until then. You didn't invest anything. You used the money my mother lent me for the move to buy new furniture that she neither wanted nor needed. Caitlin stood up, trembling. I didn't know, I swear I didn't know any of this. She turned to Greg, tears streaming down her face. You have to believe me. They always said they were helping us, that Helen was happy with the changes. I believe you, replied Greg, holding his wife's hands, and we'll overcome this together. But your parents need to leave, now. What followed was an explosion of accusations, threats, and finally, resignation. Carl and Marcia, realizing that their usual tactics would no longer work, began to collect their essential belongings. This isn't over, threatened Carl one last time, before leaving with a small suitcase. Nobody humiliates us like this and gets away with it. Actually, Mr. Miller, replied Paul, the journalist, we've already contacted your other victims. They're all willing to testify. You're not in a position to make threats. When the door closed behind the Millers, a heavy silence took over the room. Caitlin sobbed quietly on the sofa, consoled by Greg. Helen suddenly felt exhausted, as if all the weight of recent weeks had collapsed upon her shoulders at once. We'll resolve everything tomorrow, suggested Richard, noticing his mother's exhaustion. Today we all need to rest. In the weeks that followed, Helen's house slowly returned to normal. The original furniture was recovered from the basement. The walls returned to displaying the colors she had chosen. Family photographs resumed their places on the shelves. Greg and Caitlin, determined to start over, rented a small apartment nearby. We need to build our own story, explained Greg, honestly, without shortcuts. Helen offered financial help, but he gently refused. You've done more than enough, Mom. Now it's our turn to walk on our own feet. Caitlin, still processing her parents' betrayal, began therapy. I want to understand how I was manipulated for so long without realizing, she confided to Helen during an afternoon tea, and I want to make sure I don't repeat these patterns with my children. Richard, who had extended his stay in the United States, helped his mother reorganize not just the house, but her life. Together, they installed a modern security system, changed all the locks and created protocols for future family visits. Maybe I should sell this house and buy something smaller, suggested Helen one night, as they watched the stars on the porch. It really is too big for just one person. This house is your story, Mom. Your refuge, your achievement. Richard squeezed her hand affectionately. The size doesn't matter. What matters is that you feel safe and happy here. On a Sunday afternoon, 2 months after the confrontation, Helen received an unexpected visit. Danielle, The social worker who had attended the false complaint came to check how she was doing. "I heard about the outcome of your case," she explained. "I wanted to make sure everything is okay now." Helen invited her for coffee, sharing the details she couldn't reveal before. Danielle listened attentively, taking occasional notes. "Your story needs to be told, Mrs. Morgan," she said finally. "Many elderly people are going through similar situations and don't have the courage or resources to defend themselves. And so, with Paul's help, the journalist, Helen began to participate in lectures and support groups for elderly victims of patrimonial violence. Her testimony, serene and articulate, inspired others to seek help. On a particularly significant afternoon, after speaking to a group of women in similar situations, Helen returned home feeling a fullness she hadn't experienced for a long time. Upon entering, she walked through each room slowly, as she had done the day she bought the property 15 years before. In the kitchen, the aroma of homemade bread she had baked that morning still lingered in the air. In the living room, the rays of the setting sun filtered through white curtains, identical to those she had before, recovered from a trunk in the attic. In the office, now again her space for reading and reflection, books aligned on the shelves, each one in its designated place. In the master bedroom, her bedroom back in its rightful place, Helen opened the drawer of the bedside table and took out the blue notebook. She sat on the bed and wrote what would be her last entry in those pages. Home is not just shelter, it's memory, history, choice. It's where love needs to be free, not imposed. I learned that protecting our space is not selfishness. It's an act of self-preservation, of self-respect. Today I understand that opening doors to those we love doesn't mean allowing them to invade us. True welcoming comes with clear boundaries and mutual respect. My house is at peace again, as is my heart. And there will always be space here for loving visits from my children and grandchildren. Visits that begin and end, allowing each one to build their own story in their own space. Helen closed the notebook and walked to the window. On the horizon, the Portland sky was tinged with orange and pink. Soon Richard would return to Boston, to his own life, to his son, who was growing far from her. Greg and Caitlin would begin a new chapter, in their own home, built with honest effort. The grandchildren would continue visiting her on weekends, filling the house with laughter and stories. And she, Helen Morgan, at 62, had rediscovered a fundamental truth. Dignity has no price, respect is not negotiated, and true bonds flourish only where there is freedom to be who we really are. That night, she slept deeply, without nightmares, without startles. In her dreams, the house breathed around her, welcoming and protective, as it always should have been. The end. Dear listeners, we hope that Helen's story has touched your hearts and made you reflect on the value of our personal spaces and the respect we all deserve, regardless of age. To continue this emotional journey, we've prepared a special playlist with equally moving stories that explore complex family relationships. Find it here, clicking to the left of the video. If you liked this narrative, don't forget to subscribe to our channel, like this video, and share it with someone who might identify with Helen's silent struggle. Every day we bring unique stories that explore the depth of human feelings and the small great battles we face. See you in the comments.